Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. David Peña-Guzmán, and I am here today to interview an old friend of mine and a philosopher by the name of Simon Truwant. Simon, welcome to our YouTube channel. Dr. Truwant is a philosopher at KU Leuven, and I am visiting him at the moment. I am in lovely Brussels, Belgium, and we're here at Simon's office. And we're about to talk about this wonderful book that he wrote in 2022. That's when it was published by Cambridge University Press, entitled Cassirer and Heidegger in Davos. So we're going to be talking about the Davos debate that a lot of people have presented as the point of origin of the split in contemporary academic philosophy between analytic and continental approaches. Dr. Truwant, Simon, thank you for being here. Welcome to our show.
Well, thank you for being here in Brussels.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's been a lot of fun. We've been catching up, chatting, and I've been thinking a lot about doing this interview with Simon about his work because I think it is of interest to a very wide number of people, including people who are interested in the history of philosophy because, it's this interesting moment in 20th century thought, but also for people who are interested in the two figures that appear in the title and that sort of organize the book, who are Heidegger and Ernst Cassirer. So let's just begin at the very beginning of the story, which is this debate that took place in Davos in the 1920s. And I've read about the debate, but I actually don't really know that much about the details of the debate. So I thought we would begin by having you sort of set the scene for us about this debate that everybody talks about that was so important for the formation and the evolution of European philosophy. So tell us what the debate looked like, who was there, why is there suddenly this debate being staged between these two figures in the 1920s? So paint the picture.
Okay, yeah, great. There's quite a lot to paint. It was a public debate between two philosophers, Cassirer and Heidegger, in something that we would now call a summer school. It was in the spring, but it lasted over 2 weeks. There were a lot of people present, a lot of younger philosophers as well. For example, Emmanuel Levinas was there. He was still a student. At the moment, very much a fan of Heidegger. Later, his affinities would turn, so that's there's a history there as well. And they were gathered there for 2 weeks, and there were a number of speakers, philosophers who gave lectures. So Heidegger gave 3 or 4 lectures of 1 hour during the course of those 2 weeks. Cassirer did the same thing, and they were both. If you look back at it, you can see that they were already venturing towards this one debate that they then held at, I think, the second last day of this meeting. And so it was in 1929. It was the second year that the Davoser Hochschulkurse was taking place. And the whole idea of it was to bring together French and German intellectuals, philosophers, but not only philosophers, after the First World War, where those two communities had just been, separated, completely separated, closed off from each other, and the idea was to reunite that. And they had done it the year before as well. Now they wanted the really big names, and sort of the irony is that the whole recollection of this debate is that no one was brought together at all. Because the recollection is that it was a failed debate, that they were talking next to each other, that Heidegger was superior both rhetorically, intellectually, in terms of feeling the sense of the time. And so all the younger witnesses, but also journalists, there were newspaper journalists attending this debate, philosophical debate, and they all wrote, okay, this was not really a debate, they're talking next to each other, or they were also saying that Cassirer, who I can imagine that many of the listeners, viewers don't know.
Tell us who he was, because you're right that, Heidegger, a lot of people who are interested in philosophy, they will know the name, obviously. Yeah. But Cassirer, even though he was, sort of this counterpoint, has somewhat been forgotten. Yes. And you talk about that in the book.
He's somewhat been forgotten, and this debate is a big part of the reason. But before that, at the beginning of the 20th century, Cassirer was maybe even the biggest philosopher at one point in Europe. For one, because he was known as a very good historian of philosophy. He wrote several volumes looking at the problem of knowledge throughout the whole history of Western philosophy, but also because he was a leading figure in neo-Kantianism, which also has been largely forgotten, but right then, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was one of the dominant schools in philosophy. However, during this debate, the people present there really sensed that this neo-Kantian philosophy, that it was getting outdated, that Heidegger was coming with this new breath of fresh air, which is a little funny to call existentialism because it's sometimes very grim, but yet that's how people felt. And so Cassirer, in the optics, losing the debate was, sort of ended his popularity. And that was, that was confirmed in a sense because a few years later, Cassirer was a Jewish philosopher. A lot of the neo-Kantian philosophers were Jewish thinkers. And so a few years later, Cassirer had to flee Germany first and then Europe. And he never really got the opportunity to reaffirm his position or his intellect in the public setting. Whereas Heidegger, for reasons that your viewers may know, because he was aligned with National Socialism, he got to stay in Europe, of course, and in Germany, and he got a chance for the next decades to continue building his career and his image.
Yeah, and one thing that I recall from your book is you talk about how after this encounter in Davos, this public debate where the two minds sort of meet and Heidegger skyrockets, then there is this kind of downward turn for Cassirer. And in particular, the story of Cassirer's emigration, how he then eventually dies in the US. But how this also got reflected in the concerns of each thinker. So, of course, the debate is only kind of like a scene or an episode in a larger dispute between these two thinkers, right? Like they're commenting on each other before, they say some things after. So it's a much longer sort of intellectual conversation and debate than just this one thing. But you do point out that, after this debate, Heidegger sort of moves on from Cassirer and, sort of just chucks him off to this, he's one of the neo-Kantians, we're not doing neo-Kantianism anymore. I'll come back to that in a second. I'll ask you about neo-Kantianism. Whereas Cassirer, who was the more established and respected scholar, he continues his engagement with Heidegger and increasingly adds a moral reclamation to his encounter or to his engagement with him because of what he sees as this trajectory towards Nazi ideology.
Yeah. And then there's a lot of projecting. Also, Toni Cassirer, the wife of Ernst, wrote a biography in which she says that she was present at Davos, that she could already sense it in Heidegger's figure. That's very speculative, of course. But it's definitely true what you say. After Davos, there's no real reason for Heidegger to continue engaging with Cassirer because it feels like, the debate it's been done.
I won.
Heidegger was victorious, so there's no reason. And Cassirer probably had, I can only imagine, had much more frustrations about that event. But also, of course, saw Heidegger developing further and further into this in political sense. And the last book that Cassirer wrote, which was published, so Cassirer died in 1945 on campus of Columbia University. And the last work he had been writing was called The Myth of the State, and it's very much in line with all of Cassirer's work, but applying it to Nazi mythology and dismantling that. And of course, it's at points explicitly the strongest criticism of Heidegger that he has ever uttered. Even though, as you say, this had been going on in a sense for 23 years. 23 years that they were engaging with each other at certain moments.
So, I'm glad that you gave me some details about this summer school. I didn't know a lot of the technical issues about the format of the debate and how it actually played out. But in terms of understanding the philosophical scene in Europe at the time, it does seem to be that it seems like neo-Kantianism as a school, and whether it should be the dominant way of doing philosophy moving forward, that's the question that is front and center at the time in a lot of philosophers' minds. And so I want you to say a little bit about what neo-Kantianism is in very general terms, because you also talk about in the book that about the fact that, well, neo-Kantianism, Cassirer certainly was a neo-Kantian, but not in the same way as other neo-Kantians of the time. And so tell us what neo-Kantianism is, and then we can take the discussion from there.
Yeah, okay. So I'll try to do it as simple as possible. So obviously neo-Kantianism is a new philosophical current or movement based on Kantianism, so on Kant. So that's the main source of inspiration. But it takes Kant's thought in a very particular direction. If we look at Kant's own philosophy, what he wanted to do was figure out what are the conditions of possibility of metaphysics, of metaphysical thinking or metaphysical knowledge. And in order to solve that question, he first checks, okay, what are the conditions of possibility of scientific knowledge, of mathematics, of physical knowledge. For Kant, that's really motivated by the metaphysical question. Neo-Kantians do it the other way around. They do it very differently in the sense that they feel like, oh, that metaphysical question has been answered by Kant. There is no metaphysical knowledge in a clear sense. And so they don't care about that question at all. And they only look at the previous parts of Kant's critical philosophy, and they just look at what are the conditions of possibility of scientific knowledge. Of course, by then, we're talking end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, scientific knowledge has really advanced, where Kant was checking out the conditions of possibility of Newtonian physics. Those neo-Kantians had to deal with theory of relativity, with quantum mechanics, with all those new developments in mathematics as well. And so they focus on science and they ask these questions. And so they say we start from facts, and by facts they mean certain scientific knowledge, and they look at the conditions of possibility of that. And that's the only thing they really look at. So the question of the thing in itself, for example, is completely put aside.
Which already was kind of put aside by Kant as a kind of bracketed X, as this thing that we don't really know, but that maybe is just like the originary cause of our being affected by an external world. But even Kant doesn't say all that much about the thing in itself.
No, but it's still an issue that he needs to get some, say something about in order to separate him from previous thinkers. And so for the neo-Kantians, that's just completely out of the picture. That's just not a concern anymore. And then Heidegger, his whole philosophical project is about the possibility of metaphysics, once again. So his main motivation is completely different. So he thinks that the focus on science is maybe a secondary at best philosophical interest, but not at all something that should be the main concern. And related to that is that the neo-Kantians, so they dismiss all metaphysics, which means any question about the objects in themselves, but also about the subject in itself. And so the subject for the transcendental subject for neo-Kantians becomes this very abstract, formalistic notion of sort of cognitive epistemological capacities or
processes
faculties.
even.
Yes. And so that's the second point for Heidegger. There's no human being there anymore. There's no Dasein there at all, but there's no existential motivations, there's no concerns, there's no, so everything that Heidegger would say makes us human beings, makes us Dasein, it's just completely gone in this very rationalistic approach. And so both the project, are you interested in metaphysics or are you interested in scientific knowledge? And then the approach, do you do an existential analysis of Dasein, or do you have this rationalistic approach to faculties of knowledge, are completely different.
Well, and here you start seeing why this is often framed as the point of split between analytic and continental approaches, right? With analytic philosophy, at least as it's been traditionally cast by historians of the discipline, as fundamentally concerned with being a handmaiden to science, right? Beginning from what science tells us about the world, and then adding something that philosophy can proffer, like clarifying concepts, explaining how that scientific knowledge is possible, but really bracketing aside anything that does not directly contribute to expanding our scientific understanding of the world. And then on the other hand, continental philosophy as saying, no, there are all these other questions about Dasein, about existence, about the human condition.
Anxiety,
culture, history, so on and so forth. And so, I'm really happy that you brought that up, because then that becomes the way in which this split gets sort of almost mythologized historically.
Yes. If I may add, so the interesting thing is that Cassirer doesn't neatly fit into that distinction. Because Cassirer, as different from the other neo-Kantians, is that he broadens this search for transcendental conditions to not only look at them for scientific knowledge, but also for art, for language, for mythology, for politics. And so he does have a much broader picture. It's still in that same tradition, but he does cover all the spheres of meaning that human culture or human existence are invested in.
And I actually think that's really intriguing in itself, that Cassirer, this philosopher, then gets put in this debate in the position of representative of neo-Kantianism, even though he is dealing with questions that then later get associated with continental philosophy, and even with the existentialist approach to thinking about the human condition, right? Like, he writes extensively about non-scientific subjects.
Yes, absolutely.
And so, if anything, I feel like he was made to represent a school of thought that does not represent him very well. If anything, the debate should have been between Heidegger and probably Carnap. A more scientifically oriented philosopher among the neo-Kantians.
Yeah. Carnap was present in Davos, was one of these younger students. I don't know at which level at that point, but he was present there. And one of the very fun anecdotes is that so they went skiing during, because it's
really?
It was in so Davos is this Alp town. Heidegger would show up a few times in a ski suit because he had, he disliked all of the formalities of conference. So he would show up in a ski suit. But also at one point they were, I think, in a lift going up into a mountain, and somebody had missed Heidegger's lecture and asked Carnap, "Oh, so what did you think of it? What was it about?" And Carnap says, "Bim bam boom." So he just thinks it's utter nonsense. So I don't know if we would have had a really good debate between those two.
Well, if people already thought that Cassirer and Heidegger were like two ships passing in the night, Heidegger and Carnap would have been even more so, because even in writing, so for example, when, and this is not about Carnap, this will go back to Cassirer, but even when Cassirer writes about Heidegger, it's extremely dismissive. It's just metaphysics is literally nonsense. It's people saying things that don't make sense. And he focuses a lot on Heidegger's notion of the nothingness or the nothing in his writings, to say, look, this is a clear, what we would now call a continental concepts that just highlights the vacuity of this thinking. But I'm happy that was not the case. Although this story about Heidegger just showing up in like his ski suit, it makes me think, and you do talk about this also in the book, it makes me just wonder to what extent charisma and personality played into people's perception of who won this debate. Because Heidegger was this young guy, very charismatic, very dominant in the debate, whereas Cassirer came across as this older academic scholar that was very reserved and who was much more ecumenical and conciliatory in his tone. And you say, I forget where in the book, but you say that didn't win over the audience. It didn't win him any points. So I'm curious about that, how the personality maybe kind of forced the issue in people's eyes, and we think that Heidegger won just because he was domineering, young, and fresh.
Yes, but there are multiple aspects to that. So yes, it's clear from the journalist reports, from other philosophers who wrote about it, that they speak of Heidegger. He enters the room. That's also the image he already had from his teaching in Germany. He enters a room or a classroom and everyone's like, wants to listen to this guy. Apparently he was very, very charismatic, very interesting.
Just like us, obviously.
Of course. And Cassirer is the one who everyone acknowledged is super knowledgeable, is very erudite, but a bit more boring, more like maybe a historian of philosophy, you would say, who gives great overviews and but less exciting. And Heidegger points this out as well. Afterwards, he says that I didn't like the debate because I don't like debates anyway, he says. And
who was this?
This is Heidegger who says this.
Okay.
And he also says, and the audience was really all about Cassirer versus Heidegger, and I wanted to be about ideas. But thirdly, he says, and Cassirer was too polite, like too obliging, too reconciling. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure from all the eyewitnesses that played a huge role, just the personalities. But the personalities say a lot about their philosophy as well. Because so Cassirer is the one who writes about politics, mythology, language, different cultures, all kinds of different cultural uses and languages. And he tries to develop a system in where you can somehow still think those things together. Mm-hmm. Even though he never wants to dismiss their differences, how can we think this together? And he also wants to think his own thought and Heidegger's together. He does this with the history of philosophy. He tries to find patterns. Heidegger's philosophy, it's about, as he says, polemos. It's war. Thinking is war. And so thinking needs to be disruptive. And it needs to really, shake things up.
Well, the destruction, right, of history, of the history of metaphysics.
Yes, that too. So get rid of all the stuff from the history of Western thinking that has misled our thinking and led us away from the real questions. And so the personality and the thought is definitely in line with each other. And also, not just on the personal level, the charisma, but also on the level of thought, Heidegger's approach was just between those two world wars, between after the devastation and everything that had all the results from the First World War, the impact it had on German culture and the German mind. That was much more interesting, not to go back to this modern, reconciling, progress-oriented kind of philosophy that Cassirer had, but shaking things up and acknowledging the existential threats that are there. It all ties together, I think.
Yeah, and the idea that he just sort of represented the zeitgeist of the time, right? That there is just something about Heidegger that is proper to the moment.
Yes.
And Levinas, whom you said was there, he said it. When I watched the debate, I felt as if I was witnessing the death of a world and the birth of a new philosophical reality.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, you mentioned that Heidegger was concerned about how Cassirer's sort of obliging attitude prevented a real encounter about the ideas.
Yes. Yeah.
And I want to go to the ideas now, because let's just put this up front. In your book, you say, and here you have a little picture of Davos, where the debate took place. You point out that most academics, including philosophers who have written about the Davos debate, talk about it primarily for its sociological and political consequences. So, let's go back to Davos as a historical moment, almost as a historical document that we're going to use to interpret things that happened afterwards. Largely because of this perception that there was no real encounter of the minds. There was no real philosophical debate. It was just maybe a clash of personalities that then marked this larger cultural shift. Yeah. But your whole book begins by saying, no, we need to go to the ideas themselves. Yes. What was the debate ultimately about between them? Yeah. And you argue that it was about a couple of things, right? And you already mentioned one of them, that it was about how do we interpret Kant?
Yes.
Do we interpret Kant as, like the essence of Kant's legacy? Is it about metaphysics?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it about figuring out the conditions for the possibility of contemporary scientific knowledge?
Yes.
So that's one split that you've already talked about. But you also say that the debate was largely about the nature of the human condition. They don't see it in the same way. So I want you to say a little bit about that.
Yes.
What's the disagreement between Heidegger and Cassirer at the level of ideas, including, if you want to go back to that issue of Kant, we can, but also the human condition?
Yeah. So I distinguished three topics. You mentioned two of them in this order, the proper or lasting interpretation of Kant's philosophy. Then the second one is the human condition. And the third one is the task of philosophy. And my argument is that actually the third one is the one they're concerned about the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And
the task of philosophy.
Task of philosophy. And it only becomes clear at the end, but there are different clashing ideas of the task of philosophy is what motivates them to have different ideas about the human condition. Mm-hmm. And their different ideas about the human condition motivates them or inspires them to have different interpretations of Kant. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the human condition, I would sum it up by saying that Cassirer's main question throughout his entire philosophy of culture is how can we orient ourselves in a meaningful way in the world? Mm-hmm. And more specifically, how can we do so in various ways? Because we can orient ourselves in a political way, in a religious way, in a scientific way, in an aesthetic way, and so on. And Heidegger's question is, why do we have to orient ourselves in the world? Mm-hmm. Why are we seeking for meaning? Why do we need to constitute meaning the whole time? Mm-hmm. And so the how question with Cassirer is clearly, it's a different version of what are the conditions of possibility. How can we orient ourselves in the world? How are we constituted that we can constitute political meaning, religious meaning, scientific meaning, artistic meaning, and so on? And that question leads to a focus on the potential of the subjects, the capacity to constitute meaning, to constitute culture, that then will live on after we have passed away. And so it focuses on capacities, it focuses on rationality, it focuses on the progress, because we keep constituting more and more advanced cultural meaning. And Heidegger's why question is motivated by the fact that why do we have to keep doing this over and over again? Why do we always have to project meaning into the world? Why do we always have to project? Why does Dasein always have to project a certain self-understanding and a certain self-image? And why do we always... And the question is because we are, well, as Dasein, as metaphysical beings, we are limited. We are in multiple senses, but so we don't have a fixed ground and we don't have a fixed purpose. So we are this endlessly restless being, haunted by an anxiety for meaninglessness. And because of that, we have to orient ourselves meaningfully in the world over and over again. And the moment we stop doing that, we become inauthentic beings because we let the world orient us. We just follow what other people say. But so I think that's the main distinction, and that is then connected to a different understanding of the task of philosophy, because the task of philosophy for Cassirer is to show us how we can, in various ways, constitute progressively interesting and valuable cultural meaning. And so it's an enlightenment project. It shows us our rationality, it shows us our capacity to overcome our natural limits through reason. And Heidegger's project is how can we get to terms with the fact that we are limited beings, that we are finite, that we are failing beings, that we don't have a stable ground, and so that we have to keep doing this and never will be successful at it. And so I call Cassirer's philosophical project an enlightenment project, which is why it wasn't that popular anymore at the beginning of the 20th century. And Heidegger's a therapeutic one. So how do you get to terms? How do you get to be content with the fact that you're a flawed, limited, finite being?
Yeah, and so in terms of putting these two side by side, at one point you use the opposition between, of course, finitude in the case of Heidegger and almost this infinite power of reason to furnish ever new forms of expression for humans and for meaning formation, whether that is through science, as many of the neo-Kantians were really interested in. But in the case of Cassirer, who is much more pluralistic, also, we do it through politics, we do it through myth, we do it through art. And so Cassirer is looking at all these social forms, or he calls them symbolic forms, to be more specific. He says this is what we do as humans. It is in our nature as humans to sort of activate our symbolic function, and that is a rational capacity that we have, and that gives us this enlightenment sense of the capacity of reason. Whereas in Heidegger, you have much more of an emphasis on limit, on thrownness, on finitude. And so you end up with this enlightened versus therapeutic conception of what each of their projects is. And so in that sense, both of them in some ways are answering the same question, which is the problem of orientation for the human being, right? So at least they agree on that we need to figure out why we feel disoriented in the world and how we root ourselves in some way in existence, but they just give very different answers to that question.
Yeah, because they are themselves oriented towards different directions with regard to the same issue. Because where you have Cassirer explaining how we can orient ourselves in human culture or constitute human culture, which is the same. Heidegger, of course, Dasein is a being that constitutes a meaningful world around itself. And so of course, it's very different language that they use, but they're tackling the same issue, but then they look at it from two different perspectives. And that creates an opportunity, even though they may not have liked that, but for me, it creates an opportunity to try to think them together without diminishing their differences, but to see them as struggling with two components of a larger problem, the problem of meaningful orientation in the world.
And it's interesting that all of this, you talk about these three things: the task of philosophy, the nature of the human condition, and then the proper way of interpreting the legacy of Kant. And it's interesting that those two other questions about the task of philosophy and the human condition, ultimately, it seems like they get played out through this battle over who is more Kantian than the other one, truly, right? Because Kant is just such a towering figure in the history of philosophy that these two thinkers at the start of the 20th century are trying to say, no, look, I am the true heir, the descendant of Kant. I'm more Kantian than you. And so even though Heidegger, is critiquing neo-Kantianism as a school, Cassirer himself points out, look, there's a lot of neo-Kantianism going on in Heidegger too, because we're both sort of trying to do Kant for a new era, or be the Kants of the 20th century. So I'm curious about what you make about that, about the centrality of Kant just in this whole debate.
It's a complex issue because when they're using him in the debate, I feel that it's very superficial because it's more about the battle with neo-Kantianism instead of their own different interpretations of Kant. Heidegger makes a distinction between, you have your epistemological interpretation of Kant and I have an ontological interpretation of Kant, but it's not clear what it means. They don't explain it there. Then there's a distinction between emphasizing the spontaneity of the Kant's notion of transcendental subjectivity, that would be the Cassirer position, or the receptivity but it's also not very well explained. And so in the actual debate, they explain this in their own books at length, so they have really something to say about it. But in the debate, it's actually a minor point. They want to get past it as quickly as possible and talk about the human condition and then the task of philosophy. And then when they talk about those two other topics, Kant isn't mentioned anymore, but I feel like Kant is there the whole time in the background. Because, for example, when talking about the human condition, the idea of orientation, Kant has a great short essay, What Does It Mean to Orient Oneself in Thinking? That's sort of an inspiration source for their two different approaches to the orientation question. When they talk about the task of philosophy, not in the Davos debate, but elsewhere, they try to connect it to Kant's notion of a cosmopolitan conception of philosophy. So I think he's maybe more present where he's not explicitly addressed than where he is addressed, but that's gets more complicated to figure that out.
Yeah, but I mean, and that makes sense, right? That he was in the background in the debate. The debate was meant to be this public-facing event that was ultimately about the relationship between philosophy and the humanities, right? Like that was the theme of the Davos debate was what is a human being, and so it makes sense that the focus was on how they understood the human condition rather than maybe textual, hair splitting over how to properly read particular aspects of the Kantian project, whether that's the critique of pure reason or the critique of judgment. But now, as a way of bringing this to a conclusion here, I want to ask you to reflect a little bit about what you make of the debate now. So you wrote this book in you didn't write it in 2022. No. I've known you for long enough to know that this book has been in the works before that. But it came out in 2022. And now, looking back at it and really teasing apart the ideas, these issues over Kantian scholarship, over the human condition, and over the proper function of philosophy in human life. What would you want to share about the Davos debate? How does this change our interpretation of the debate? And also whether you have any thoughts about, this larger issue that many other people have written about, which is how this debate kind of led to the contemporary layout or the landscape of academic philosophy, with the split between the analytics, who sort of are following that, let's say, Cassirer, Carnap way of doing philosophy, and then, of course, Continental philosophers who are deeply indebted to Heidegger. So what do we make of it now?
What I make of it is that, so what I noticed when doing this research is that within the groups of scholars that know about Cassirer, because he had been forgotten for a long time, that it was really either or. So there's a group of an international group of Cassirer scholars, and they do not want to know about Heidegger. Heidegger is the one who destroyed their hero, but also more broadly has a very problematic history. And so his ideas are considered dangerous. If you look at the international group of Heidegger scholars, of which I've also been a part, they just still considered Cassirer as an unimportant thinker. It's superficial, it doesn't address the real questions. And so it was really two camps. And I tried to get past that because I think that they are both very interesting and very rich thinkers, but also just the very attempt of trying to think them together, that's a real philosophical way to approach the issues that are at stake here. And so my real goal is to try to find a way and not just, say, okay, they either talked past to each other or one was more intelligent than the other and there's that. No, try to think them together. And in order to do that, you need to figure out what the motivations are. Why is someone doing philosophy? What is the main motivation or the main approach that someone has in order for then addressing specific philosophical problems or reading an older philosopher like Kant? And so it's only when you I think, connect the three topics of the Davos debate and then look at the real motivation, that things start to move. And there you can see what they have to learn from each other instead of how they disagree. And for me, that's an interesting way of doing philosophy. I don't really care about just seeing why people disagree. No, how people disagree, but why they disagree. And then once you know why they disagree, how they can be thought together again. And that's something that for me was missing. Also in the approach that, which comes from Michael Friedman, that looks at them as the origin of the split between Continental and Analytic philosophy. They're on a much larger scale. The same is going on. We have camps of Analytic philosophers and we have a big camp of Continental philosophers, and they just don't see eye to eye. They have a very different approach, and very often they don't see what the other person is doing as real philosophy or as valuable philosophy. And I think there as well, that goes way beyond this book project. I haven't done this, but there as well, it would be valuable to try to look back and see, okay, what kind of problems are they dealing with and why do they do it in this way? And then acknowledge that there are different approaches, different strategies, and you can learn by, not choosing just one strategy, but looking at.
No, I really like this idea of trying to get at the motivations behind what are obviously disagreements and different modes of thinking, because not only does that allow you to find the common ground, in this case, at the origin of this debate, you say it is a question about orientation. They both are fundamentally interested in that, but you can't see that unless you sort of really look through what on the surface appear to be positions that don't touch one another. But even beyond that, once you pay attention to that, it clarifies things that are otherwise mysterious. Like, why are certain philosophers adopting one style of argumentation or one writing style even, right, as opposed to another one? There might be that they see an essential connection between that writing style, however bizarre it might seem to another person, for a specific reason tied to their motives, tied to their philosophical commitment, so on and so forth. And so I do think that in your book, you're giving us, let's say, a non-Heideggerian mode of doing philosophy, where philosophy is not war. We're in Brussels, the home of the European Union. So maybe you're giving us a European Union model of doing philosophy, where it is about seeing what people share in common as the starting point for a philosophical discussion. I don't know if you think that's a fair characterization, not to necessarily bring the politics of the EU specifically into your book.
No, I'm very happy with it. Other people, especially the ones who are more leaning towards Heidegger, who read the book, will point out that my approach is more Cassirian in that sense. It's about trying to think very different ways of being in the world, or ways of thinking, trying to think them together, which is what Cassirer tried to do. How can we think together religious thinking and scientific thinking without just installing a hierarchy, but seeing how they can, in a way, both contribute to a richer picture of the world. That's the disclaimer. In the end, I take more of a Cassirian position than a Heideggerian, but I think it's the one that makes you see the most, and that's what I try to accomplish.
Yeah. So, for our viewers and listeners who are interested in learning more about this Davos debate, about this philosophical encounter between Ernst, Cassirer, and Martin Heidegger, I recommend Simon Truwant's book, Cassirer and Heidegger in Davos, published with Cambridge University Press in 2022. It has a great combination of historical detail and specificity, but also sort of really digging into the philosophical details of the ideas. How are these thinkers relating to the past in order to try to open a new door toward the future? So I highly recommend this book, and I'll see you all in a future video. Thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Truwant, thank you so much for being here.
That was great. Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.